How'd you like that? Thank you. How'd you like that? Now, for those of you who wondered what in the devil you tuned in on, that was a kind of a free-form recreation of a radio program as it could very well have been heard and was probably heard, that kind of show very widely heard, just about the time of roughly the late 1920s and the early 30s, possibly even a little earlier than that. And for those of you who wondered what in the world we were using the actual equipment of that period. Let you know what it really sounded like. This is no filters, no fakes, nothing else done to alter the sound. And the actual microphone that I'm using, or was using, I'm using a contemporary mic, of course, right now. The actual microphone that I was using was and there it is, it's got the number all over it. It is a 1923, and it was used up through the early 30s. It was a 1923 model, a 1923 double-button Western Electric carbon broadcast mic, a very rare microphone. And, of course, it was broadcast. There are a lot of amateur microphones around at that period, but this is a broadcast mic, which was a very special character. For those of you who are technically inclined, this is a double-button carbon, and you can tell there's plenty of carbon hiss in there. Although, to be perfectly honest, the hiss is a little louder or a little higher on this particular mic than it would have been during its heyday, because we have not repacked this mic. This has got the same. For those of you who might wonder about this, there's a big difference here between the types of microphones used now than were used in the early days of radio. The microphone of the time. I'm almost falling into that pattern of speech, the microphone. You notice how the announcers spoke with we've been listening to a lot of transcriptions of ancient shows here. And all the announcers spoke with a very distinct and very articulated speech. Very formal. This is Franklin P. Knight, broadcasting to you from the WOR studios in New York. And now just switch the carbon mic when I give you the cue here, Herb. Just switch it on, and you'll hear the big difference. I will continue to talk. Okay, now I'm back on the carbon microphone, and you'll notice that the carbon mic, a lot of the lows that are in the normal speech pattern are cut out, and in fact, so are many of the highs. That almost all of the center, you might say the middle range, comes through quite clearly. But you can identify a person's voice on it. But you'll lose a lot of the overtones and the undertones. And this was compounded, if you can imagine, listening to this broadcast on perhaps a paper cone speaker, a magnetic speaker of the Atwater Kent variety. It was almost really nothing more than a large earphone with a great big paper cone coming out of it. So you got this high-pitched voice where if everybody talked at this kind of length, and they actually picked announcers so that they could cut through this type of microphone. So that his voice was high enough so that you could hear it very clearly, and he could speak so distinctly that one could hear it through the static and all the various crashes and rumbles that you heard on the radio broadcasting frequencies of the period. Very good. Once a pro, always a pro. Yes, sir. Now, we've got other stuff for you. Before we go any further, if you're really... Now, I must point out very quickly, this is not and has nothing to do with nostalgia. Please don't think this has anything to do with nostalgia, because we're far away enough in time from all the beginnings of this business, television and radio and all of it. When I say we, I'm talking about the whole world, everybody. That the early days of this industry are now history. They're no longer nostalgia. There's a great dividing line between history and nostalgia. And to have remembered a thing like I just reproduced there, you would have to be a very old person. You'd have to be well up in your 70s and 80s, perhaps even older, to have clearly remembered a thing like that. But that's the way it sounded, and how we got that idea, and in other words, how we really reproduced it, was listening to actual recordings. They didn't, of course, have tape recordings in those days. They didn't have transcriptions of the kind we think of. But they did have discs, large acetate discs upon which many things were recorded, and those are getting very, very rare and scarce. You can't really find them, and if you do find them, they're almost impossible to play them because they deteriorate. But the reproduction that we did was pretty close to the actuality. The music was taken off of actual radio shows of that period, which we re-recorded on tape, and the actual... Well, the commercial you heard was an actual 1931, 32. It was done in 31. They were about to introduce the 32 Chevy. And that's all very authentic. And by the way, another thing interesting is the recordings of that period were not recorded the way we record today. There were all sorts of techniques used to record. Some of the recordings were done with actual cutting discs. Others were done with a kind of vibrating shim technique, or all sorts of techniques. But very few of the techniques got any kind of depth in them. The problem was they lost a lot of the bass, they lost a lot of the high notes. So it's very hard to know what music actually sounded like in those days. I mean, if you were actually in a studio listening to the Ipana Troubadours, it would be very difficult to know. In other words, they must have sounded a great deal different in listening to them right there than they sounded over the radio or over the transcriptions that they cut at the time. But that's what you heard. I bet a lot of people all of a sudden tuned in and said, "What the hell's going on?" Hey, listen, speaking of great sounds, one of our engineers, Herb here, was digging down amid all the kind of dross that drifts down to the bottom of a radio station's enormous attic full of past and gone and defeated junk. And he came across a great old transcription of a radio broadcast, which at the time was considered quite the historical. And tune up your gain there and set your tape recorder, because this is a real piece of true Americana. I'd have to say this is Americana. And you can just see the whole difference in the media between now and then, and the attitude towards itself and the public. And this is a very interesting piece of business. So turn up your tape recorders now and listen carefully. This is from the vast archives of this. For those of you who don't know, I have to preface it very quickly here. WOR in New York, and this is not chauvinism, we're just merely telling you a historical fact, is one of the oldest major radio stations in the world. And, of course, you can always tell the very, I suppose you might say, the very early radio stations, because they have a three-letter call, among other things. Three-letter calls have not been issued for many, many years. WOR is a three-letter call. You have other great stations around the country, KNX, out on the West Coast, KYW, stations like WSB,